Okay, so our next speaker is going to be Dr. John Sinard. John Sinard got his MD and PhD from Hopkins. He went to Yale for residency. He joined the Yale faculty, and according to his bio, they have not been able to get rid of him since. He is the Director of Pathology Informatics. He was the residency program director for about 6 years, but now he's taken on a new role of being the Associate Director for AP at Yale. And he is going to talk to us today about imaging, practical stuff every pathologist should know.
All right, just sit here and give Wally's talk again. All right, so we're going to talk about digital imaging, and obviously probably everyone in this room, actually sort of looking around the room, incredible range of expertises out there. So hopefully there'll be something in this talk for everyone, but I don't guarantee it, but we'll see how it goes. So we're going to start with some basics about digital images, just things, and again, the topic was supposed to be something everybody should know, some things every pathologist should know. So we're going to try and hit some of those. We're going to talk a little bit about some practical information about implementing digital imaging. Many of you, how many people are doing either static or some form of static digital imaging at your institutions? I suspect most people. Okay, actually fewer than I would have thought. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit about that, and then we'll get into telemicroscopy and whole slide imaging, which is what everybody wants to hear about, but that'll be the last part, so you have to wait through the first part. So the concept that you can form a picture by putting together dots of discrete colors is certainly not novel. It's been around for quite some time, and that's all digital images are. They're a collection of dots. Each dot is a single color. We use the word pixel, which is short for picture element, and basically all digital images are composed of dots. And if you magnify the images enough, you'll start to see those dots. And when an image is magnified too much so that you can see the dots under circumstances in which you're not trying to see the dots, they refer to that as pixelation of the image. Digital image resolution, this is one of my pet peeves, so if you learn nothing else from this talk, please learn this. The term is used differently by different people. In the purest sense, the resolution of a digital image should be the number of pixels in each dimension of the image. So the units should be pixels. And this is because a digital image in and of itself has no physical size. So when people say that the resolution is dots per inch, but you don't have any inches, then how it's a meaningless number. So the resolution should be pixels. By convention, the horizontal dimension is usually given first, but not always. Don't confuse it with pixel density. A lot of times, people will say, "Oh, here I have the slide. Can you scan this?" And I say, "Okay, what resolution do you want?" And they'll say 300 dpi. And so I say, "Well, what eyes?" That sort of doesn't really tell me. And the analogy I like to use is if somebody asks you, "How far do you live from work?" and you say 30 miles per hour. It's essentially the same thing. If you add an additional piece of information, you can get some useful real numbers out of that. But otherwise, in and of itself, it's not usable. So pixel density is something that refers to each specific instance of the output of a digital image. And as an example, the thing that you are looking at now on this screen is a digital image. I have the same digital image in front of me. Clearly, they're different sizes. The pixel densities are completely different, yet both are developed from the same original digital image. So the resolution of an image is based in pixels. The pixel density is a property of any specific instance of the output of that digital image, whether it's projected or printed. And again, it's usually the same in both directions, but both dimensions, but there's no a priori reason why it has to be. So using this sort of analogy, do I have a pointer here? Yeah, I sort of do. Okay, so over here we've got the digital image. It's got a height in pixels and a width in pixels. We have an instance of an output of that image. Whoops, didn't want to do that. going to have to, which is, maybe I'll use the pointer, that's why people use the pointer, which has got inches in each dimension. You can figure out the pixel density by doing this thing called math, and it's pretty simple. But that applies only to this particular output, instance of this output. So then, get back to how many pixels do you need? And again, it sort of depends on what you want to do with it. So here's the same image with different image resolutions. And you can see this resolution is 700 by 450, 400 by 260, 250 by 160, 100 by 64. So how many do you need? Well, it kind of depends on what you want to do with it and who your audience is. I think most people would agree there's very little difference between these two. So this one is probably adequate for most audiences. If you're talking to surgeons, this one's probably good enough, because they're not going to notice the difference. Most people would consider this not acceptable. So you have to think about what is your audience, what is the point that you're trying to communicate, and make sure you have enough pixels to communicate that. Same is true for photomicrographs. So again, these are probably quite comparable. This, good enough for most purposes. This probably nobody would find acceptable. We have to talk about a third dimension. Not so much of an issue now as it was 5-6 years ago, but there's also the color depth to any digital image. Each pixel in a digital image can only be one color, and so the number of different colors that you have available to you depends on how many pixels, how many bits of information you use to express that color. So how does color get stored? Well, most commonly it's done using what's called the RGB color model. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. And then, as I mentioned, the number of bits that you use determines how broad a range of colors that you can use. And most commonly, right now, is 24-bit color. So most images are expressed in 24-bit color, gives you 8 bits each for red, green, and blue intensity. And that's actually more than enough. So the RGB color space refers to the fact that you can take red, green, and blue. Green is not really particularly green here, but pretend it's green. That varies from projector to projector. And by combining them, you can get all possible colors. And that's not really intuitively obvious, and it's based on the physiology of color vision in the eye and in the brain, and the fact that you have 3 different types of cones. But this has been known for a long time, and this is the way color televisions work. This is the way the digital projectors that we're looking at the output from work. There are 3 guns, one projecting red, one projecting blue, and one projecting green. For those of you who are thinking back to early days of preschool when you used to do finger painting and mix paints, and it's like, well, these aren't the primary colors. Light is an additive color model as opposed to paint, which is a subtractive color model. So what this is basically telling you, if you mix red, blue, and green light, you will get white light. Don't try that with paint. It won't work. It's sort of backwards there. But this is with 100% intensities, but if you vary those intensities and scale them back, you can actually express all different possible colors using these 3 different colors as a starting point. And I hope you all like this slide. It took me an hour and a half to make. But you can see that. So with 24-bit color, if you have 8 bits for red, 8 bits for green, 8 bits for blue, it's 256 different shades of red, 256 different shades of green, 256 different shades of blue. Gives you just over 16 million different possible colors that can be expressed. And it's estimated that the trained human eye can distinguish about 100,000 different colors, so we're well in excess of that with 24-bit color. So, the digital cameras that are trying to say, oh, we've got 32-bit color, it's even better, you'll see sharper, crisper colors. No, you won't. But if you want to spend the money, that's great. So then, once you have your image resolution in pixels and you know your color depth, typically 24 bits, you can get a calculation of how big your file size is going to be. And that's, again, simple math. Although if you're going to convert to megabytes, remember that a kilobyte is not 1,000 bytes, it's 1,024 bytes, and a megabyte is not a million bytes, it's 1,024 kilobytes, because that's a binary thing. But you can actually figure out how big your size is going to be, and your file size is going to be, and you start to realize that images of any substantial resolution really start to get kind of big. Relatively speaking, 24 megabytes used to be really big 10 years ago. Now it's like 24 megabytes. But again, that's data that has to be moved around on a network and stored on a disk somewhere. So image compression algorithms have been developed, and these are developed to decrease the storage requirements and transport time of large images when they are closed, i.e. when they are packed away in a file. And there are two different categories of image compression algorithms, lossless and lossy. What lossless means is after you compress it and then decompress it, you get back exactly what you started with. Whereas if it's a lossy algorithm, what you get back may look similar, but there's actually not the exact same sequence of bits that you started with. And again, I have to emphasize, this only applies to the storage of a file. If you're looking at the image, it has been decompressed, because you can't see a compressed image, and that will become pertinent here in a second. So the most common compression algorithm by far is JPEG. It stands for Joint Photographic Experts Group. It is a lossy compression algorithm. It can decrease the file size for an image, and it only minimally alters the image quality. You routinely get about 5:1 up to 60:1 compressions with JPEG. There is a JPEG 2000 standard. It's been available for 12 years now. Hasn't really caught on. It has a lossless compression algorithm, but it is slower, and therefore it hasn't gained a lot of acceptance, and it's not clear that it ever will. It's had 12 years. Probably isn't going to make it. What kind of compression can you get with JPEG? Pretty substantial. And you can regulate the degree of compression at the time you do the compression. Different pieces of software have different ways of being instructed at how much to do the compression. And so that will vary, whether you're using Photoshop or a variety of other software. Some of them will use the quality, max quality, high quality, medium quality, low quality. Some will give a numeric value from 1 to 100 or 1 to 5. So it all depends on the software, and you just need to figure out what your various software does. But you can see that you can get really substantial decreases in file size for the same image. Typically, gross photographs will compress more than photomicrographs, because there are larger areas. There tend to be larger areas where the color is the same on a gross photograph than on a photomicrograph. So you typically will get somewhat better compression with gross photographs. How good is it? It's really good. So just looking at the same image here, this is an uncompressed image, and this is a JPEG compressed image with the lowest quality setting. And so you can see here that there's essentially no visual difference in those two files. Now, if you magnify them, you can actually start to see some differences. There are areas here that if you get real close to the screen, you can see where there's this washout common from a JPEG artifact. But the difference in file size is remarkable. So this is a 935 kilodalton file, 55K over here. So it's less than 6% of the uncompressed size with essentially no visual deterioration. Now, because of the artifacts introduced by JPEG compression, it is not something you would want to do if you're going to then take this image and put it through any sort of image analysis algorithms. And you have to be careful if you do things like sharpening and stuff like that, because they will enhance the JPEG compression artifacts that are present in your image. But that's something to keep in mind. If you're doing this just for being able to view the images, JPEG is really the way to go. All right, so some issues about digital imaging. If you want to, there are three components to doing digital imaging in a clinical environment. You have to consider all three: image acquisition, image storage, and image utilization. So what types of images are you going to acquire digitally? What kind of hardware are you going to use to do that? Where and in what format are you going to store the images? How are the images going to get to storage? We'll go into that in a little bit more in a second. And then what are you going to use the images for? And how are they going to be made available for those uses? So in reality, a successful deployment of a digital imaging solution would depend on your attention to the practical details rather than the technical details. People tend to get hung up on the technical details, and it's the practical details you really do think about. So, workflow. Consider the workflow. Where are these images going to be taken? Who's going to be taking them? Do they have time to take those images? So that's sort of a really big thing. Every once in a while, someone in a high leadership position in your department will make a statement like, "Oh, well, the slide's on the microscope stage. Just snap a picture while you're signing it out and include it in the report." This person does not sign out. So keep that in mind as you go through those processes. But you need to consider all three steps: acquisition, storage, and utilization, and begin with the last step, utilization. Because if you don't know what your images are going to be used for, then you kind of don't know where you're headed on this. So you're going to use this just for documentation. You're going to view them at sign out, embedding in patient reports, projecting at conferences, incorporating into lectures, or quantitative image analysis, because that may change some of the components of your solution. So for digital projection, most digital projectors project at a maximum resolution of 1024 by 768. It may be the limit of the projector, it may be the limit of the communication between your computer, most commonly a laptop, and the projector. Some of the newer ones are a little bit higher than that, not a lot, so they can get up to 1200 by 800, or even 1400 by 1200, 1600 by 1200 rather. So that's something very concrete to go by. So if, let's say that it's 1024 by 768 and you're going to project an image. Well, if you have more than 1,000 pixels, you can't project them all. And so somewhere along the way, those pixels are going to be thrown out. So you've been carrying around pixels in your file that aren't going to ever get projected and they'll never see the light of day, as it were. And so there's no point in having those pixels in there to begin with. In practice, I find that having 500 pixels across for a full screen image is more than adequate, and it uses a quarter of the memory. If it's a pathology audience, often I'll go to 700 pixels, but in that range is sort of where you want to target. If your image isn't going to fill the whole screen, but just part of the screen, then you can use a proportionately smaller amount. How do you get images into digital projections? So most of these projection software, presentation software, will start to choke if the file size gets above 40, 50 megabytes. And so you want to sort of keep it under 10 if possible, certainly under 20. And the way you do that is you use JPEG compressed images. Now, most people think they are putting in JPEG compressed images into their presentation software, when in fact they are not. And so you need to be careful about how you do this if you want to make sure you're inserting that. Because what people will do is they will open their digital image, they will, in their image editing software, they will edit it, tweak it, crop it, save it as a JPEG file, but still, while it's open in their image editing file, they will select it, copy it, and paste it into their presentation file. So remember, JPEG compression happens when you save it to the disk. The image you save to the disk is JPEG compressed. The image in memory is uncompressed. When you copy it and transfer it over to your presentation software, you have copied and pasted an uncompressed image, and it will take up all that space. So that's not the way you want to do it. The way you need to do it is you do the cropping and the editing in your image editing software, save it to disk as a JPEG. I typically use high or maximum quality. As long as your resolution is low enough, that's fine. Close the image file from the image editing program, and then from the presentation program, use an insert image from file and select the file you just saved. It will then load the JPEG file into the presentation software and unpack it at the time the slide is presented. And try it, you'll say it'll make a huge difference in the size of your files. If you're going to be printing, obviously the biggest question is how big of a print are you going to do, and how far away are people going to be when they're looking at that print. So typically 150 pixels per inch is usually adequate for most printing, even though everybody seems to like 300 dpi for who knows what reason, but that's usually more than adequate. So if you have a 1024 by 768 printed image, that's 5 by 7, 146 dpi is the calculation, so that works out just fine. The same thing if you're doing a 3-inch wide print, which is a single journal column, incidentally. That's going to be over the 300 DPI that most journals seem to want for who knows what reason. 8 by 10 prints will require more pixels if you want to maintain that pixel density. Again, JPEG compression is strongly advised, even though some of the journals will say, no, we can't have a JPEG compressed. You can. You can play games with them, but it's in theory, you'd like to think that it would be the quality of the image that would be the determining factor, not the particular characteristics, but, well, that's a game that has to be played. All right, putting images in patient reports. Very valuable, very potential, very common use of images. You have to decide, is it really adding value to the reports? Why are you doing this? Who are the images for? Does it add real value to your reports? Does it add simply perceived value? Don't get me wrong, there can be a lot of dollars in perceived value. But if that's why you're doing it, then make sure that's just, you know that that's why you're doing it. So I think that that's an important thing to do. My personal preference is we put gross photos in our patient reports. I think there's value to the surgeons to be able to see the specimen. I think there's value to the patients who the surgeons will often share the reports with. For the patient to be able to see a picture of their kidney that has a tumor in it, because before that they didn't really have anything concrete to base it on. In contrast, I think putting photomicrographs in reports has little value. It's not of much value, I mean, to the surgeon. Certainly of very minimal value to the patient. We don't make our diagnoses based on a single field for the most part. And finally, the last thing I want is a urologist calling me saying, well, you know, you called that a Gleason 7, but the picture really looks more like a 6 to me. You know, so you have to just sort of decide whether you want to deal with those sorts of things. Storage and management. The acquisition devices you use, the use for your images may change over the course of time. However, whatever you choose as your storage modality out of the gate, you will probably stick with for a longer period of time. So put some thought into that, because it's really difficult to go back and change the way you've stored all of your images. So, workflow issues to be considered. Where are the images going to be acquired? Is it going to be one place or many different places? What types of images are you going to acquire? Who's going to need to access the images? How are they going to get access to the images? Where are they going to be accessed from? What types of images access is needed? So are they going to need to just be able to view it, or are they going to need to be able to download it? What about annotations? Do you need to provide that support? To whom? How long are the images going to be available or accessible? Are they going to be available forever, or are you going to say after 2 years we take them offline and burn them onto some long-term storage? How many images do you expect to have, and do you have enough storage space to accommodate that? So those are the kinds of questions you need to think through in your environment. Likely things are going to start off small, and then they're going to ramp up. If you do your job real well, they're going to, and you create a solution that is very usable, the needs for storage are going to ramp up faster. And so you need to address that. If you do your job really crummy, no one will take any pictures, and you don't have to worry about storage. You know, I guess you can decide how you want to play that one. There are technical issues that need to be addressed with this. So what file format are you going to use to store your images? We store all of ours as JPEGs. Where are they going to be stored? What sort of hardware device are you going to use? We have a central server for that. What is the structure for the image storage? We actually use two different structures, both database and a flat file directory. I'll talk a little bit more about that in this afternoon's talk. How the image is going to get to storage, what tools are going to be used, what assurances are they that the images are actually being stored in the right place. Usually there's a person involved at some point of the way. Are they doing the right job? Is there any way you have of checking to see if they're doing the right job? Positive identification of the images in storage. So if you have an image in storage and it's stored as image number 4632189, and you export it as image 4632189, do you have any idea what case that belongs to? And so there's that element to think about. Is it going to be restricted? Do you need to restrict access to the images? How often are things going to be backed up? Is it going to be incremental or bulk backup? Is the storage solution scalable? So if are you going to putting in a device that you're going to run out of storage, and then how are you going to? If your setup requires all the images to always be in the same place, What happens when there's no more room in that place? Do you have to get rid of images? Can you make the place bigger? Can you put some in one place and some in another place? Are you going to purge these? How is it going to get purged? And do any of the answers to any of those questions change with image type? And then finally, acquisition. And this is, one of my favorite lines. I'm using the same 35mm camera I bought 20 years ago. It works great. If I'm going to switch to digital images, I want to buy a camera which will meet all of my needs for the next 20 years, remain compatible with my current and future computers and software, and always be supported by the vendor in case I need to get it fixed. Be real. It's not going to happen. Interestingly, the inability to find the perfect digital camera has really stopped more digital imaging efforts than anything else. Ironically, the camera is the first part of your imaging solution that you're going to get rid of and replace. So don't sweat the camera. It's unlikely that a single camera will be the best fit for all of your different applications, so consider the possibility of different cameras for different applications. And it's unlikely that any camera is going to last more than a few years, especially depending on the environment that it's in, so you maybe don't want to spend $20,000 on the camera. So you don't feel so bad when it's time to throw it out. Interestingly, vendors don't like to work on cameras that are covered with blood. I don't know why. And then don't buy the camera until you're ready to use it, because while it's sitting in the box, its value is dropping, and there's something newer and better that's being made for less for less money. This is just, I'm not going to go through every one of these things, but I think just to point out that in different environments, there may be different features of your digital camera which will be important to you. So, for example, in an autopsy suite, it might be important to be able to use the camera untethered to a computer, because you want to take in situ photographs, and some of those bodies just don't fit on the copy stand. And so you want to be able to carry the camera around with you. It's not so much of an issue for photomicroscopy. On the other hand, for photomicroscopy, it's really important that you have a threaded lens mount, so you don't have to use duct tape to get the camera to stay on the microscope. So you might look for different features in different environments, and this will be in the handout, so you can sort of use that. There are a lot of commercial digital imaging solutions out there, and some things you need to look at when you're evaluating those. So the image acquisition steps, what range of hardware and devices are compatible? That's an important thing to look at. Vendors can't keep up with the rate of introduction of the low-end cameras onto the market, constantly developing and validating software that works with those acquisition devices. So they tend to develop software for the higher end cameras that don't turn over as quickly. So your vendor is likely to say, well, if you want to use our solution, you have to buy these $8,000 cameras as opposed to buying these $800 or $200 cameras. So keep that in mind. What cameras do you already have, and is there any compatibility with those? What's your workflow for acquisition? How many clicks does it require? And what's the case locking? What have I mentioned? Case locking. So commonly you're going to do image acquisition in the gross room. And if you happen to have an environment where there's a camera at every single grossing station, you're lucky. We don't have such an environment. We have a couple of separate grossing stations. So what typically happens, the resident takes out the specimen at their desk, they open up the case in their LIS, they start to gross in the specimen, they cut into it, oh, this is going to make a great picture, they take it over to the copy station, they try to take a picture, and what does it say? You can't get into the case because the case is locked. Who's locking it? Oh, you are, back over here. So you run back to your grossing station, unlock the case, go back to the camera station, someone has moved your specimen out of the way, and they're taking their picture, and so you do have to think about the workflow steps when you're looking at these things. How important is it to be able to annotate images or store image attributes? You have to figure that piece out. Does your software solution allow for uploading existing images, and can you do it in bulk, or do they have to be done one at a time? What about the storage? Is it stored in a database, or is it stored as flat files? Do you have any options for exporting? Can it be done as single images? Can it be done as bulk? What file format? What's the file naming convention? Again, this positive identification, or is it assigned a random ID number that you're then going to have no idea where the image was from if you happen to export two of them? Is access needed by non-LIS users? If you're only able to access the image to the LIS, then anyone who needs access to the images is going to need access to the LIS. And so you have to decide if that's acceptable for your environment. And what is the implications should you decide to migrate your LIS to a different vendor? Are you going to be able to get those images out, or are they lost forever? All right. So that's basically the first two parts. Now I'm going to talk about telemicroscopy and virtual pathology. How am I doing time? Oh, I'm doing fine on time. Good. There may even be time for questions. That never happens to me. So telemicroscopy and virtual pathology, and I want to start by trying to define a little bit better some of these words, because I think the words are used often interchangeably and relatively loosely. So nobody knows what anybody is talking about when one talks about use these terms. So let's try to constrain this a little bit. First, telemicroscopy, I think, should be used to refer to the various technologies which enable the viewing of a microscope image at a site that is remote from the image acquisition site, somewhere where the microscope isn't, for example. I would avoid telepathology, telemedicine, teleconsultation when you're referring specifically to the technology, because those are uses for the technology. And as we'll see as we go through this talk, different technology is more appropriate for different uses. And so you have to match the technology to the particular application. So don't confuse the terms. Basically, there are three major categories of telemicroscopy technologies. There's static imaging, there's dynamic or real-time imaging, and those have both robotic and non-robotic subtypes, and we'll talk about those. And then there's whole slide imaging, which also goes by virtual microscopy or wide field telemicroscopy, with the thought that sometimes you have an image the whole slide, but just part of the slide, so maybe that's not the best term, but it does seem to be the one that has got the greatest degree of traction. So let's go through these technologies briefly and talk about what makes them good and what makes them not so good. So static telemicroscopy, otherwise known as store and forward. And basically you have a pre-selected static digital images that are obtained by hopefully a diagnostically skilled individual. And then they're sent, usually via email, to some remote person who looks at them and says, I think this is an X. So what are the advantages of this? Well, it's inexpensive. Almost every place already has all the equipment they need to be able to do this. So you could start doing this tomorrow. Not today because you're here. Well, maybe not tomorrow either. But you know, the recipient usually doesn't require any special software other than an email account and a computer to be able to view those slides. And it's pretty easy to document what you sent if there was ever a question later about, well, maybe the diagnostic field wasn't sent and that's why I got the thing wrong. The disadvantage is you're only sending select fields of view, so the person taking the pictures has to know enough to know what pictures to take, so that the person looking at the pictures has the diagnostic information. So there's greater skill required there. And this is typically what those sorts of systems can look like. You've got a microscope, a camera on it, goes into a computer, you take some pictures, take those pictures, stick them into an email program, email it off to the recipient who views these on a computer screen. Dynamic non-robotic telemicroscopy, otherwise known as real-time video microscopy. This is a technology where the remote viewer sees a live video feed through the microscope, but it is the sender who controls the microscope. So that controls the slide movement, controls the focus, controls the magnification. Advantages is it's reasonably inexpensive. You need a video server, but that's about it. So you can usually set this up based on your existing equipment for under an additional $1,000. You can get this thing working. The viewer can request any desired field, but this is usually done over telephone communication. So the person, the viewer, sort of says, move left, move right, zoom in over there, and that's how they get to sort of see what the parts they want to see. There's an opportunity for education during this interaction, so that's always nice. And typically you can do this through the web, and there's no specific hardware or software requirements at the viewing end. The disadvantage is you still need a reasonably diagnostic person. They have to know how to use a microscope, they have to navigate to the diagnostic areas of the slide, and you have to coordinate the viewing with the recipient, which can be problematic, especially if the person's in a different time zone. So, you know, what do these look like? You've got a microscope with a video camera on it this time. The output from the video monitor goes into a video server. The video server basically sends whatever gets on its video signal out through the internet, and it can be viewed through just by going to the IP address of this video server. You don't even need a computer on this end. It's sort of built into the little video server box. These things are available, interestingly, through the security industry is where most of these are available. People who want to have closed circuit, they want to monitor their places of work from home, or they want to monitor their home from work. So they set up these video cameras, and so that's what has driven the cost of this equipment down quite a bit. We have one set up for a frozen section microscope. Any time of the day you can go and see what's on our frozen section microscope. So if you're bored, feel free to look. If you think you know the diagnosis, give us a call. Dynamic robotic telemicroscopy is very similar, except this time the viewer now gets to control the microscope rather than the sender. And so what that means is you need some extra wires and things, and a specific user interface to allow that viewer to control the microscope. It also requires more expensive robotics on the microscope. So the advantage is the viewer completely controls the field selection, assuming you've put the correct slide on the stage. There's no specific diagnostic skills needed on the sending end. And some of these come equipped with slide loaders where they can pick slides from a whole set. So you can queue up a bunch of slides from multiple cases, but that significantly increases the cost and frequency of jams. Disadvantages: more expensive equipment needed at the sending end. The recipient may need special software, but usually the vendors provide that for free. And the slide is, however, tied up waiting for the viewer until the viewer gets around to viewing it. It's sitting there on the microscope. Maybe the entire equipment is tied up until that can be arranged. And there's also no way of documenting what was reviewed. So this is, again, a rather crude depiction of the equipment, but basically you have a bunch of wires coming out of your computer that hook into various parts of the microscope, can control things like the turret, the stage, and the focus. The rest of it is sort of the same. Of course, when you start doing things like this, there's no a priori reason why this even needs to look like a microscope anymore. And so there are some viewers who just, it's a box that the slide disappears into, and all that functionality is built into the box. And so those are things you can buy as well. And then finally, whole slide imaging. Has a variety of other names, as I've mentioned. And in this technology, the entire slide is digitally imaged into a very large data set. And it's stored on a server, and a remote viewer uses software not to view the slide, but to view the captured image of the slide. And usually the interface is designed to simulate the activities of a microscope, but there's no a priori reason why it has to. The advantage is the viewer has complete control over the viewing. No diagnostic skills or even a person is needed on the sending end. Any number of slides can be made available if you have enough disk space and bandwidth. And you can store what was available for review, although not necessarily what was looked at. The disadvantages: you need very expensive equipment on the sending end, and the recipient needs special software, but again, that's usually freely downloadable. Because of work of Bruce sitting out here on the second row, he's going to be talking later, and a number of others, working group number 26 has put together standards for how to store DICOM image information. Store whole slide image information within the DICOM wrappers. I'm not going to go into the details of this, but there was a substantial collaborative process that took many years and a fair amount of travel. But supplement number 145 was adopted in September 2010. So now there's official specifications by which whole slide images can be stored in DICOM. And therefore in PACS systems that are available in most institutions. I don't know that any current PACS vendors support this particular standard, but the specifications are out there, and soon there will be increasing support for those, especially if the demand for those were to increase. How do you deliver whole slide images? Well, there's two options. One is to just give the entire data set to whoever the viewer is. That's problematic. These things are often on the orders of gigabytes in size, and so even with a high-speed network connection, it can take quite a while to transfer that file. But that's an option. Most commonly, you put them on a server. And the concept of server delivery of whole slide images is that at any given time, the viewer is only viewing 1024 by 768 pixels. And so they only need the pixels that they happen to be looking at any given time. And that amount of information can travel very fast. And so when the viewer requests a particular part of the image, the server grabs those pixels from the image and sends just those pixels. As the viewer pans to the left or the right, the server goes and picks up the additional pixels and sends them. So if any of you have used these things, you're seeing the image. You notice when you pan to one side, the part that was already there stays there, and the other part fills in slowly as it requests the additional pixels from the viewer. So that's how that works. So we talked about the, I guess technically 4 different technologies now, and contrasted them. So the expense of the equipment starts off low for static imaging, goes to very high for whole slide imaging. The diagnostic skill needed starts out very high and goes down to 0 for the most expensive whole slide imaging technology. The rate limiting step for static images is usually taking the pictures. For dynamic or non-robotic, you have to set up coordinated viewing. For robotic, it's viewing. Interestingly, for whole slide imaging, it's often acquisition again, because there's often a queue of cases that you've got to get these images into. And then there's maybe some special hardware requirements. But having now a concept of the different technologies available, you can start to build a matrix of what are these technologies useful for, and what applications, what would be the best technology to match a particular application. So, for example, if you want to share a case with a clinician, well, you could do static images, and that's pretty good. But dynamic non-robotic might be even better, because you can talk to them and teach them and show them what you're looking at. Whole slide imaging or dynamic robotic is probably not very useful if they don't know what they're looking at. You can give them the image and say, oh, here it is, go look at that yourself. But if they don't know what they're looking at, that's kind of pointless. Student teaching, the first two are the same, but students are supposed to be learning what they're looking at. So whole slide imaging has got great value for student teaching. They don't need the glass, they don't need the microscopes, and everybody is looking at the same level. So it's not like if there's a feature you're trying to get everybody to see and you realize that it's not on every section that's out there in the student labs. And I'm not going to go through all of these. You can sort of debate how many pluses should be in each part of this. But the point I'm trying to make here is that there are different technologies, and they're ideally suited for different applications. And so no one technology is the perfect answer to every possible application. And you may have to work to dispel that belief from people at your institutions who think that if I just get the one right system, we're all set forever. The big question mark down here is this guy. Does whole slide imaging have a role for routine primary diagnosis? And I think that one is one that is being somewhat debated, and we'll talk about that in a bit. I still have time, great. So let's just talk some about the technological components. If you do want to start using whole slide imaging for routine use, you have to think about file size. So if you assume a 20 by 10 millimeter tissue section, one plane of focus, a 20x image uncompressed is about 2.4 gigabytes of data. 40x is about 9.6 gigabytes of data. With compression, JPEG 2000 will give you better compression, but it's a lot slower. JPEG faster, not as good a compression. You're talking in the range of 400 to 600 megabytes compressed for that slide. If you assume 100 specimens per day in your practice with an average of 10 slides per specimen, that means all parts, all blocks, all levels, all stains. So that is not an unreasonable estimate. In fact, if you only have 50 specimens a day, maybe you're generating 20 slides on average per specimen, so it's still going to be in the ballpark. If you assume a good image compression, so you get it down to 500 megabytes per slide, you're still looking at half a terabyte of data a day. Okay, so that's not inconsequential. Now, granted, you can that is not uncommon to see that on laptops, but and if you only work one day a year, that might work out really nicely. But otherwise, you're going to start to fill up that space pretty quickly, and so you need to plan for a fair amount of storage. What about scan time? A lot of manufacturers are advertising 1-minute scans. Our slide, or even less than 1-minute scans. Usually that's just 20x, and you have to decide if that's adequate for your needs. Usually it's small specimens, not filling the entire slide. They probably don't have residents who stuff as much tissue into each cassette as possible. And it usually doesn't include the time it takes to load the slide, to unload the slide, to name the slide, to QA the slide, and to make sure it gets filed in the right place. And that's sort of extra time, so you have to think about that. But let's take our same example, 100 specimens, average of 10 slides per day, 10 slides per specimen rather. Assume a 1-minute scan time and 0 time to load, unload, QA, and file. So that still comes to about 1,000 minutes or 16.7 hours to do a day's worth of scanning. So that's okay, there's more than 16 hours in a day, but it means everything's going to be delayed a full day. So what does that mean? You're probably talking about more than one scanner. Now, if you get 16 scanners, you can be done in an hour, but you have to budget that accordingly. What about bandwidth? Nobody thinks about bandwidth. So if you're assuming that people have a big monitor and they're looking at big images, 1280 by 1024 images, which is 1.3 megapixels, 3 bytes per pixel, because it's 24-bit color, and we talked about all that, 8 bits per byte, all that good stuff. So you're talking about close to 4 megabytes per image. If JPEG compression is being used, 15:1 is about average, so 262 kilobytes per image. You're assuming that if someone's looking at an image, they're looking at about 1 image every 4 seconds, which is about reasonable if you're scanning through an image. So 64 kilobytes per second. If you assume that you have 10 pathologists in your practice who are doing this at the same time, what does that come to? It comes to a bandwidth usage of 5.2 megabits per second, which is about 4 T1 lines worth of bandwidth, which is substantial. And so you have to kind of talk to your network people and see if they mind if you routinely use a quarter of the bandwidth of the institution, and what the implications there might be for that. This one is often a harder problem to fix. You can get money and buy scanners. You can get money and buy disk space. Replacing all the wires in the walls of your building to accommodate faster bandwidths often becomes a little bit prohibitive, but something to consider. However, when people move into whole slide imaging, more than likely it's going to be done in a stepwise fashion, starting with 1 or 2 work cases, expanding to additional cases. So think about the various things you might want to use it for: presenting at tumor boards, clinical conferences, archiving for future reference. So like for return consults, that probably will be one of the first things we do. We're not doing that yet. We are doing the first step. The internal QA, peer review, this is sort of an ideal technology for that. Frozen section coverage at distant facilities, it's being done in some places. And sometimes, one can question whether that's really legal. The FDA hasn't really weighed in on that. Quite frankly, I think an illegal diagnosis is probably better than the wrong diagnosis, but you have to sort of figure that out. Outbound second opinion consult, inbound second opinion consults, case referrals, these are all possible uses that you'll probably hit before you get to routine primary diagnosis. There are infrastructure issues that need to be considered, and I think it's important to emphasize these are not decisions that should be being made by your IT folks. These are pathologist-based decisions because there are implications for your practice and your way of life and what decisions are made. So what scanner are you going to use? What's the storage going to be? What kind of image server capability do you need? Are you going to have fault tolerance with multiple servers? What's your network performance? Is it going to be up to the task? Image viewing software, how is that going to get to the various places where you need to view images? What kind of monitors do you need? We'll talk a little bit about FDA and validation, but then ultimately workflow. How does this fit into the workflow of your institution? The CAP put together, in their Pathology and Laboratory Quality Center, put together a expert panel. You can see the makeup of that panel. Many of the individuals in this room are represented on that panel. We started meeting back in 2010 for what I thought would be 3 or 4 meetings, which has just gone on and on and on. But we're nearing the end. We almost have got a white paper together. I'm going to talk a little bit and present those findings in one of the scientific sessions tomorrow for those interested. But we basically come up with what we think, in our opinion, is an appropriate way of validating whole slide imaging before you use it in a clinical setting. So we're going to talk about that. I'll talk about that then. However, in an interesting little development at the Pathology Visions Conference last November, Trammell Faison from the FDA made a few statements that sent some ripples through the whole slide imaging community. And I have a few quotes here. So we believe that whole slide imaging raises new questions of safety and effectiveness that must be answered through pre-market approval in our Class 3 devices. Okay, so that just pushed FDA approval back 5 years probably. We will be requiring non-clinical and clinical studies to objectively and precisely validate performance. An interesting little one, there's not much standardization of H&E staining, and we believe that it may be necessary for there to be some additional standardization for digital pathology in order for this work to work across the board. So if your places are anything like mine, I mean, our lab doesn't produce 2 slides with the same H&E staining intensity on the same day. And a pathologist has a remarkable ability to adapt to that. But if you're going to start to put requirements on that, that has significant implications for making this work. Also, whole slide imaging systems are not considered to be laboratory developed tests. Darn, there was a way we could have validated it and called it an LDT and gone on with it, but they've now sort of said, no, we don't consider that valid. And finally, I think the FDA has been very clear to the manufacturers that if you know someone is using your research use only device for clinical use, you should cease and desist doing that. So they pretty much put their claim here that this is not something you're to be doing. And for those of you who have whole slide imagers, you probably noticed that shortly, actually a little bit before this, your vendor approached you and made you sign a document saying, I will not use this for clinical purposes. I understand this is research use only. And that ruling was the reason for that. So what are my take-home messages? Well, I think digital imaging as a replacement for gross and routine microscopic photography offers many advantages over film. We didn't go into a lot of those, but many of them are very obvious. Workflow considerations, not technology decisions, should really drive your implementation. So that is really sort of the key thing. How is it going to work in your practice? Where is it going to work in your practice? Whole slide imaging does offer immediate application for some non-diagnostic activities, but I think, as an understatement, caution is advised if using this for clinical purposes. I wouldn't pack up your microscope just yet. And the key to this, pathologists have to understand this technology and have to be the ones making decisions about what technology should be used because this is crucial to the survival of our discipline. So I think with that, thank you for your attention, and I'll take whatever questions people might have. Not a very inquisitive bunch this morning. We're still trying to wake up.
You're standing between them
And break, yeah, I understand. All right, we have one question in the back.
I don't know how this question is, but somebody else is asking. Is there other lessons to be learned from what radiology went through to go?
So the question is, are there lessons to be learned from what radiology went through? Don't get me started. So I think there are so many things that are different about digital imaging in pathology than digital imaging in radiology. That you know, although on the surface there are some similarities, and certainly the FDA is trying to play on those similarities, I think that there are major differences. Basically, you know, remember in radiology, the digital imaging replaced film, so they don't have film anymore. We still have to make the slide. So the digitization is an extra step for us. And you have to decide, is there value in that extra, very expensive step to do that. I think that the endpoint, statement I don't make when there are a lot of radiologists in the room, but you know, radiologists form impressions, pathologists make diagnoses, and I think that there's an important difference there that needs to be kept in mind. But it is a little scary that the FDA is trying to play up some of those radiologies, some of the analogies to radiology, to the point that they're talking about, well, if you're using this for whole slide imaging, maybe there has to be dictated standards for what the ambient room light situation can be, because that's all dictated in radiology reading rooms. That's why you go into the rooms, and the rooms are sort of dimmer. That's all required by FDA standards. So I think that those are important distinctions. How it's going to all play out in the end, who knows? Another question, yes.
So short of full slide imaging, does that decision or the consideration, the possible consideration to make that a class 3, does that impact anything that you've discussed?
The other technology. So the question is the FDA's statement of that you really can't use whole slide imaging for routine H&E diagnosis, does that have a ripple effect and apply to other technologies? I don't know the answer to that question. The FDA is typically pretty vague about what they feel falls within their scope and doesn't. So this was actually the first statement. People had been operating for years that, well, the FDA hasn't said anything, we can kind of go about our business. They put a stake in the ground with that particular statement. It's not clear whether it applies to other modalities. More people might, because the others are based more on a microscope, and there's still a microscope in the picture, it's easier to sort of say, well, this is just an extension of the microscope, and the microscope is already an FDA-approved device. So now this really does fall into the LDT, laboratory developed test, because we're just taking components that have already been approved and piecing them together. So I think you can probably make that argument and get away with it pretty well. But there hasn't been a clear statement one way or the other by the FDA.
What about a statement from CAP or any other organization?
You know, CAP and other organizations can express opinions. They don't have any force of law, unlike the FDA, which does. You know, this work group that I mentioned will give our opinion on what we think is appropriate for validation. And there are a few instances where we know it is in conflict with statements the FDA has already made. Perhaps the FDA will be amenable to reconsidering those decisions. Perhaps they will not. It will ultimately be their call, at least in the United States. For those of you who are joining us from neighboring countries, you can do whatever you want to.
Any other questions? Okay.